Welcome to News from Neptune for May 10th in the 19th week of 2019. I'm Carl Estabrook. The socialist Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a self-proclaimed socialist government a century ago, said, "The most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening." Friends of this program insist we call the government that killed socialist Rosa Luxemburg a social democratic government. Remarkably enough, we seem to be verging on a discussion in the U.S. about what those terms mean. It's not easy, owing to more than a generation of U.S. propaganda that has obscured the meaning of these words. Noam Chomsky, who inspires our program, says terms like capitalism and socialism have been so evacuated of meaning that I don't like to use them. There's nothing remotely like capitalism in existence. To the extent there ever was, it disappeared in the 1920s. Every industrial society today is one form or another of state capitalism. That doesn't deny that state capitalist regimes that called themselves socialist made immense strides in the 20th century, in Russia and China, etc., and it's an advance that the term socialist has, after generations, literally, been reintroduced into American political discussion. Since 1990, News from Neptune has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available at archive.org. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, either repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. David Green and I will try to say some true things on an oil and poisoned water edition of News from Neptune. I want to start with a point made by our researcher, Jeff Nicholson, about why the U.S. is criminally trying to overthrow the government of Venezuela. Jeff quotes the independent journalist Greg Palast, who says, and I quote, "People don't know this, but the American financiers, the Koch brothers, have these giant refineries, oil refineries, some of the biggest in the United States or the world, on the Gulf Coast of Texas. They're in the middle of oil fields, but they can't use Texas oil because it's literally not heavy and filthy enough, and so they have to take almost all their oil from Venezuela, the only place where you can get the super heavy oil. Normally it's discounted, i.e. Venezuela sells it at a low rate, but because they know the Kochs have to use their oil, Hugo Chavez, who was president of Venezuela, a really bright man, says Palast, was squeezing the Kochs and charging them, he indicates how, and charging them a premium for his oil, for Venezuelan oil. And the Kochs have been going crazy. They've been losing money at their refinery because of the price. So you have two choices. You got to get an XL pipeline, and it's taking too long to get there. So first, you got to get Trump to come in as president and overcome all of the EPA's objections, everyone's objections, and gets the XL pipeline approved, and it still isn't there. So what do? You better overthrow the government of Venezuela, the country with the largest store of oil in the world, and of particularly of the oil needed by the Koch brothers' Texas refineries. You can overthrow the government of Venezuela with some guy named Juan Guaido, who has said, and I quote, "I will open up the Venezuela oil fields to American companies in particular." And so you have to understand, writes Palast, Exxon was basically thrown out of Venezuela. They've had lawsuits going against Venezuela. Guaido says he will pay off Exxon, and he will let Exxon take control again of the Venezuelan oil fields. That's what this game is about. It's about the oil. Close quote. A word more on this point, the shocking things that the United States has done to kill literally tens of thousands of Venezuelans with the sanctions the U.S. has placed on the country are in aid of the American oil industry, and particularly the Koch brothers. But there is much more to this matter. This is another question of politics in our backyard, as Americans have traditionally said about Latin America, and we may mention that as time goes on. But for the moment, we'll contemplate the crimes that the U.S. is committing against Venezuela for oil. What's top of your list, David?
Well, it's a letter to the editor that I sat down and wrote in the past week.
Okay.
And it's based on topics we usually talk about. Social inequality, which is a fancy academic word for economic inequality. I'm going to refer once again to a couple of economists from Berkeley named Emmanuel Says and Gabriel Zucman, who are colleagues of Thomas Piketty in Paris. And I'm just going to go back to studies that are getting a little bit dated. I hope they update them soon, but I think that the impact of what they're saying hasn't changed at all. This is in honor of Graduation Day weekend. It's in honor of the celebrated and very wealthy Graduation Day speaker, a man named Larry Geese, who has basically bought the business school, and not only that, has his picture, or his name, not his picture, thank God, plastered on buses around town. And it inspired me, this whole long articles about his background and his wealth and the wonderfulness of wealth in the local newspaper inspired me to write this letter. In 2014, Berkeley economist Emmanuel Says and Gabriel Zucman published through the National Bureau of Economic Research, quote, "Wealth Inequality in the United States Since 1913, Evidence from the Capitalized Income Tax Data," which is a fancy title for they took income tax data and through that developed methodologies to sort of estimate wealth on the basis of that income data. This is available online. You can skip the first 40 pages and just go straight to the charts, which should be understandable to anyone. With sound data and transparent methodology, they argue that since 1979, quote, "the rise of wealth inequality is almost entirely due to the rise of the top 0.1%, not the 1% as we talk about or is commonly referred to since Occupy Wall Street, the top 0.1%, that is 1/1000th wealth share. That share of that 1/1000th of the people went between 1979 and 2012 from 7% to 22%, a fantastic rise, which is a level, they point out, almost as high as 1929, right, obviously before the stock market crash. In 2012 dollars, the dollars haven't changed that much, but that needs to be said. Between 1986 and 2012, the wealth growth rate, that's how much people, the net worth of people, not their income, their net worth. The wealth growth rate of the bottom 90% of families averaged 0.1% per year, resulting in an average wealth of $84,000 per family. The family unit is what they're talking about in this particular study, 84,000 per family, which might be one person, but is often more than that, which is 22% of total wealth. That is, the 90% had 22%, which was down from 36% from the prior date, 1986. Basically what they're saying is the wealth of 90% of the families on average didn't budge during that 24-year period. Meanwhile, the growth rate of the top 1%, 1.6 million families were operating on a base of 160 million families in the country at that time, averaged 3.9% per year, resulting in average family wealth of $14 million and a 42% share. So we've got the bottom 90% at 22%, the top 1% at 42%, and the top 1% of, which is 160,000 families, accounted for, let me just continue reading. Of this top 1%, the top 0.1%, aforementioned, 160,000 families, accounted for over half of the 1% wealth. In other words, wealth is as concentrated within the 1% as it is between the 90% and the 10%, or the 10% and the 1%. Wealth just gets extremely concentrated whenever we go up from 1% to 0.1%, or even 0.1% to 0.01%. So this 0.1% has 22%. 1 in 1,000 has the same amount of wealth, 22%, as 90% of the families. And the average of this 0.1% is 73 million in 2012. Moreover, the top 0.01%, and now we're down to 16,000 families, 1 in 10,000, possessed 11% of that 22%. Half was possessed by the 0.01%. So again, concentrated, extremely concentrated, which in terms of 2012, of the total wealth, private wealth of the country, about $55 trillion, as they calculated in the study, 6 trillion was out of that 55 trillion, 6 trillion was in the hands of 1 out of 10,000 families, okay? Which had increased its share from 2%, again, up to 11%, a fantastic, a monumental increase since 1979, from 2 to almost over 5 times as much share. And to get to the point of Larry Geese, what I say in this final paragraph here, in a letter which probably will be published in about 10 days or so, when it's my turn, when it's my monthly turn, quote, what I wrote: globalization, financialization, tax reform, quote unquote, outsourcing, union busting, and austerity have enforced this trend. Private equity, which is a particular kind of financial management in this age, which is what Larry Geese made his money off of in Madison Industries, is one piece of this neoliberal puzzle. When the university celebrates his donation of appropriated wealth, it celebrates the relentless financial warfare he and the capitalist class wage against the vast majority of workers and families. And let me just footnote that by saying that private equity is something I've tried to learn a little bit about, tried to understand a little bit about. There's actually a nice interview on the podcast This Is Hell with Chuck Mertz of the 2 women who've done the best research on the role of private equity, for better or worse, and they're not critical of all of it. And they probably wouldn't necessarily be critical of Larry Geese, because he isn't one of these kind of guys. From what I understand, his company is pretty secretive. But he's not one of these kind of guys who strips companies, like the Sears guy, Eddie Lampert, who strips companies of their, their assets, goes into debt, and then ends up getting rich by basically destroying the companies which they buy. Larry Geese, it doesn't sound like he does that, but what I'm arguing here, Carl, is that it doesn't really matter, because these are financial engineering tools. There are many of them: hedge funds, private equity, various kinds of things. All this financial sector, in this fire sector, finance and finance, insurance, real estate, which has transferred all this. How does this 7 of the 1%, how does the 7% become 22%? How does the money, the value produced by the workers in those places, including Larry Geese's companies or companies held by his company, how does that get transferred? How does all those trillions of wealth, literally trillions, get transferred from the workers' work in those companies to the pockets of Larry Geese, so that he has hundreds of millions of dollars, and so that he can afford a $150 million gift to the Geese School and then be honored for that and claim that he's being charitable, when all of the business school is doing is training people to live in his world, to live in his understanding of this sort of neoliberal financialized world. That's the way it works now. That's who this university has been sold off to, and people don't have a sense of the magnitude of the wealth of both the income and especially the wealth, which is even more eye-popping, that has been transferred to the not just the 1%, but the 0.1%, the 0.01%. I don't know the capabilities of people of actually grasping this, of understanding how unjust it is, how unfair it is, and how that the wealth is produced by the workers, not by Larry Geese.
So you don't think, David, that he has all that money because he earned it, huh?
No, I don't. I mean, one could talk about strict Marxist terms of value and exploitation, and that the labor theory of value, that it's the workers who produce that value and that surplus value is taken by
somehow he extracted it. Huh?
And it's not. It's a different thing than getting. It's a little different order of exploitation than getting oil out of the ground in Venezuela, but still, it's all exploitation. It's taking the value of land, the value of resources, or the value of labor, ultimately, which is only given value by labor.
And I think people don't realize the extent to which this situation, which has existed, as you suggest, since the old man in the British Museum analyzed it in the middle of the 19th century, how much the situation, in fact, has changed in our lifetimes, including primarily the last 40 years. I admit my lifetime is a little more than that, but still in all. Yeah. In the last 40 years, what you've described has become acute. What's happened is that the concentration of wealth in the hands of that ever smaller group of owners, as you say, the concentration of wealth has accelerated remarkably in the neoliberal age, that is, in the last 40 years. It's concentrated, and it's concentrated at an accelerating rate. That is, faster and faster over those 40 years. Yeah. This has led to a number of things, including various movements, including in this state, to try to tax that wealth. But we're talking about income taxes, even with the new governor in Illinois,
he's one of them.
As you suggested early on, it's not income that should be taxed, it's wealth. This massive imbalance in wealth, which you've described in America, should be taxed rather than the taxes on income that the present governor is even talking about ways to increase. We should reduce taxes, as the right wing has been saying for a long time, to close to zero. Income taxes, income should not be taxed. Wealth should be. And the numbers on this are really quite remarkable. If we were to tax what banks call hinwees, hinwee is a high net worth individual. If we were to tax hinwees on what they owned rather than their income, we could eliminate the federal budget deficit with a remarkable ease. A 10 to 15% tax on wealth, and by wealth here I mean the actual, I don't mean to include things like your residence or your art collection or something like that.
Right.
I'm talking about money in the bank.
Yeah.
A 10 or 15% tax on wealth, over $1 million per individual. In other words, you don't get taxed if you have less than $1 million in the bank. a 10 to 15% tax on on wealth over $1 million of Americans would produce an income that would satisfy the federal budget deficit. The numbers are immense, as you were suggesting, and a shift to taxing wealth rather than income could solve it not only in the state of Illinois, but in the country at large. But we're not talking about that. The closest we come to talk about that, and we do hear that just occasionally, is a sales tax on wealth. A sales tax on wealth meaning that when you buy or sell wealth, financial transactions, you pay a same sort of sales tax that you pay when you buy groceries. This is called a financial transactions tax, sometimes a Tobin tax, after the name of a Yale economist, or in Illinois, particularly a LaSalle Street tax. But strangely, we don't hear much about that because the people who would be affected, the 1%, and almost that's literally true, 99% of the population does not have $1 million to be $1 million in wealth to be taxed, and therefore it wouldn't be affected by the tax. Only 1% would be affected by that tax, but that 1% is powerful enough, politically and otherwise, to make sure that a tax on their wealth is not seriously discussed.
Yeah, if you extrapolate a little bit from these figures, that $55 trillion in 2012. In some estimates, is close to $100 trillion now, and that includes all assets, real estate, and so forth. But even just to give people an idea about how much wealth there is just among the 1% in this state that has at least 4% of the wealth in this country, and the 1% having at least 40% of that wealth, that would mean that the 1% in this state, which is something like 100,000 families, would be worth over about $1 trillion. That's $1,000 billion. And here we are with a state government budget deficit of $3 or $4 billion, or a pension deficit of $5 or $6 billion, and in which they're straining to rig to change the income tax to the point where they can collect another $3 or $4 billion, while this $1,000 billion just sits there, primarily not taxed. I mean, yes, some of that is taxed. The real estate is taxed as property tax is fine. Just to give you an idea of how much money there is. And it doesn't work just to say that, well, they'll move out of the state. Okay,
yeah, right.
There's ways of dealing with that. It's not going to happen anyway.
National tax,
but
yes.
yeah, and it's one thing to say, well, they're just going to put it offshore. Well, you have to find ways of keeping them from moving it offshore. We have to get serious about this, and people don't realize, because really, when you're a Marxist these days, you're accused by people of being sort of class reductionist, of reducing everything to class exploitation. But it really is important for people to understand, in my opinion, that most of our social problems are worsened, are the origins of our fundamental social problems that we're dealing with, whether it's gun violence, opioid addiction, all of these things. Family issues even comes from, it's rooted, if anything, it's rooted in this nature of income and wealth in inequality, the radical nature of it, and the ultimate effects of it. That is just the reality that's going to have to change to deal seriously with any of these issues.
And as the example of Venezuela that we were mentioning a moment ago shows, the same is true for the fact that the U.S. is the greatest purveyor of violence around the world. Yeah. With the violence which the U.S. spreads around the world in some 8 wars at the moment is not talked about in this country, but that itself is a defense of the system that establishes that vast difference in wealth. And as David suggests, it's probably not going to change. That is, the foreign wars of the United States are not going to change until the domestic economy is reorganized. Under the current arrangement, with the current concentration, those wars will continue. You're watching News from Neptune. We are talking about things that are not heard normally on the mainstream media, and that itself is not an accident. I want to turn to an interesting piece that was published this morning, published this week rather, with reference, as a matter of fact, to our local press. We've been mentioning something about the things that are published around town, often not with praise, but two local publications have, at the moment, things that really should be paid attention to. I refer, first of all, to the monthly The Public Eye, which has been appearing in Champaign-Urbana for a while now, and has produced various responses politically. It has the current number, which is dated for April, which has an article by Al Kagan on Vietnam today, which is, I think, remarkably accurate. It's an account of a trip that Al, who has been involved in local politics, local anti-war politics for a long time, took to Vietnam, and summarizes the Vietnam War in a way quite different from the propaganda that we hear normally from mainstream media. There are other good things in this current number of The Public Eye, including Rick Ebenshade's account of European politics and an article by Pat Simpson on the Green New Deal. All of that's important, and I'm very happy to see that sort of discussion taking place, even in a minor, sorry, but that's what it is, monthly publication. Now, if I haven't gone far enough in talking about peculiar things in the local media, let me praise today's News Gazette. And the articles on the editorial page of the News Gazette deserve to be attended to. Leonard Pitt's column is shocking and worthwhile. The editorial in this morning's News Gazette, perhaps done by our
resident Kermudge.
That's David's account. A correspondent of this program. It sounds to me like Jim Dye's style.
All the editorials sound like Jim Dye's style.
Well, that may be may not be an accident. Barr's battle seems to me to give a better account of the sorts of things that the mainstream media are screaming about in relationship to the Mueller report than I've seen in a while in local publications. That should be attended to. And there's another one from a different place, not local, that I will recommend in connection with that. That's from Craig Murray. Craig Murray is a British scholar and diplomat who was British ambassador to Uzbekistan until he began complaining about the crimes committed by the government of Uzbekistan, and has gone home and left the Foreign Service and written about the crimes perpetrated by the British government to an international audience. His articles are disturbing enough that he has now been banned from Facebook because he said unpleasant things about the British government. And he has a piece entitled The Real Muellergate Scandal that sums up nicely, it seems to me, where that particular mishegas is. Murray's introductory line is, Robert Mueller is either a fool or deeply corrupt. I do not think he is a fool. Now, this goes on to give chapter and verse on why it is reasonable to describe the Mueller report as corrupt. Murray has been involved in writing about this matter for a while, and there is a suggestion that he was also involved in the leak of the materials from the Democratic National Committee that the Mueller report ascribes to the Russians. It seems it was not the Russians who leaked this material and therefore tried to meddle in America's election by exposing the activities of the Democratic Party and the Clinton campaign. It seems that that was a matter of an internal leak that Murray himself may have been involved with in transmitting the materials to WikiLeaks, and the crimes committed by the American government and by the American political establishment in this area are only now becoming visible. There are a shocking report this week that the head of the CIA, Gina Haspel, had gone to London to oversee the interrogation of Julian Assange, the head of WikiLeaks, who's being held incommunicado. At that time, there's now some suggestion that he's been allowed some contact with the outside world by the British government, with the idea of Assange being extradited to the United States for crimes of revealing the crimes of the American government. This is an outrageous and incredible situation, and the notion that the U.S. government, that the head of the CIA, Bloody Gina, as she's called, for her own participation in CIA torture, which seems to be very clear, has also been involved with nothing less than the torture of Julian Assange to interrogate him about these leaks and so forth of American political crimes that have found their way into WikiLeaks. It's a shocking story, and if we had a real news system in this country, you would know about it. But it seems to me that one of the best places you can find out about it right now is from Craig Murray's blog, banned from Facebook, but available still on the web for the moment at least. I recommend it highly. Search for Craig Murray and read his account of the Mueller report, and prepare to be shocked if you aren't aware of what is being said here.
I will do that. I have not read that. I wanted to talk a little bit about Doug Henwood, someone that we both have been involved with
friend of this ground
in the past. And Doug is being a bad boy and a good boy these days in various complicated ways.
Okay.
But is in the middle of a lot of arguments going on.
I should mention here that if you would allow me, David,
sure.
Doug Henwood, I first encountered years ago. He edited a what we would see as a blog now. It was in paper in those days, entitled "The Left Business Observer." That was predates computers practically, but a very good account from the left of American business practices as they existed 30 years ago. So Doug's been around for a while. He knows where the bodies are buried, and that's sometimes not just figuratively true here.
And he still, he blogs at his website and has been doing a lot of that lately for reasons which I'll go somewhat into. And he has a weekly show which is produced out of KPFA in Berkeley, the aforementioned Berkeley, where, is still Berkeley in some ways. And, well, no, it's not. But anyway, and he does his 52-minute, his radio program is turned to a 52-minute podcast, which is usually two rather concise 25-minute interviews with people that you could probably hear longer form interviews elsewhere, but if you want to hear the shorter form interviews or not read their articles or books, he does a really good job of that. And he's been involved in a couple of controversies recently. One is over modern monetary theory, which we mentioned before on this show. And his opposite in that was an MMT guy named Randall Wray, W-R-A-Y. And he's also been involved in a current debate about how we understand the current unemployment figures. He's been involved in that with a fellow named Jack Rasmus, who who has his own podcast and publishes a lot of stuff on ZNet and Counterpunch. And so Doug, who doesn't publish very much, if at all, on ZNet or Counterpunch, but usually on the Jacobin website and on his own website, they've been going back and forth about that. So not to oversimplify it, but I didn't agree with his critique of modern monetary theory insofar as I understand that. I do agree with his criticisms of Jack Rasmus. I think Doug Henwood is good with the data and understanding the Bureau of Labor Statistics data. And I think this fellow Jack Rasmus, even though he's a good leftist economist in some ways, is a little bit off base in some of his comments. But I won't go much into that, because I want to talk about what Doug Henwood wrote on Jacobin about Uber and about the IPO, the initial public offering of what it means in econ speak is that when a company sells stock, it goes public. It isn't really public, it's still private. It's just owned by lots of people. It's supposedly owned by shareholders. And what Doug writes about Uber, well, the title will tell you where I'm going with this. Uber is a scam. A glance at the company's recently released prospectus reveals the truth about Uber. It's a scam. And he goes, I love prospectuses. In a society marinating in BS, they're a rare genre where authors are legally mandated to tell the darkest truths. And Uber's is a fine example of this breed. He says, he talks about how at the start they can do some BS, but he goes, soon after the page numbers go from Roman to Arabic, things get real. First, some figures. Uber loses buckets of money. It lost $3 billion in 2018 on $11 billion revenue from its basic operations. It sold its interest in a couple of other ride-hailing firms, which enabled it to book a profit. But despite it tripling in revenue since 2016, its losses were essentially the same in both years. Then the fun begins in this prospectus. The disclosure of all the troubles facing the term. For example, you might hope that these losses are just growing pains, although the company is 10 years old. But no, quote, it says, Uber has to say about itself, we may not be able to achieve or maintain profitability in the near term or at all. After, end quote, of what the Uber prospectus said. And Henwood goes on, after reading this, who would buy Uber stock? Actually, it's likely that very few people other than professional skeptics read prospectuses, so that's a rhetorical question. More broadly, why does anyone buy an IPO? Somewhat less rhetorical. After all, they're always about insiders telling outsiders, people who know more about selling, to those who know less. If the newborn stock is such a great buy, why are they unloading it instead of holding onto it themselves? The point is confirmed by the work of Jay Ritter, the leading academic expert on IPOs. He finds that since 1980, IPOs have underperformed the overall market by 18 percentage points. If you want to play the stock market, you'd do far better with a Vanguard index fund, though a moment when the stock market is very rich a moment when the stock market is very richly valued and dodgy IPOs are getting fired off might not be the best time to start. But rationality be damned, Henwood says. The dream of finding the next Amazon or Google or Facebook keeps the racket going. It may be Uber, but the odds are it's not. So again, I'm getting back to this general theme that I'm sort of doing in this program. How is it that rich people get rich? They get rich not by producing things, but by manipulating money. And to manipulate money, you manipulate perceptions. And you get people with a lot of money doing what they do with their lot of money. And people with a little bit of money aren't really a part of this. They're just working. They're just paying the mortgage on their house. That's their wealth. They're just maybe putting money into their pension fund. Okay, that's their wealth. But it's not really wealth, it's really retirement fund. So The rich people are the people that can make money by not working, and that's what the Uber people and all these millionaires that are being instant millionaires they're being called, that are being created by the Uber IPO and the Lyft IPO and so forth. That's what they're doing. They're making it by not working. I'm not saying, of course, that the people who developed these apps and this business didn't have to work. It's just that they didn't have to labor. They didn't have to produce any value. It's the drivers who produce the value. And it's encouraging to hear. I don't know where it's going, Carl, but it's encouraging to hear that the drivers went on a brief strike this week to protest all this money that they're not getting any of.
This reminds me of the famous remark by F. Scott Fitzgerald from 3 generations and more ago. Let me tell you about the very rich. They are different from you and me. They possess and enjoy early, and it does something to them, makes them soft where we are hard, and cynical where we are trustful, in a way that, unless you were born rich, it's very difficult to understand. They think deep in their hearts that they are better than we are, because we had to discover the compensations and refuges of life for ourselves. Even when they enter deep into our world or sink below us, they still think that they are better than we are. They are different. To this reflection from the first half of the 20th century by a leading and important American author, Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway is supposed to have replied, yes, they're different. They have more money. And David and Doug explain to us why. I would like to turn to a comment by our mentor, Noam Chomsky, on the question of the horrors being perpetrated against Venezuela by the U.S. government, including a truly remarkable siege of the Venezuelan embassy in Washington, D.C., which is currently occupied at the invitation of the legitimate government of Venezuela by a group of Americans, North Americans, who are protecting the embassy against the depredations of the anti-Maduro forces, individuals in Washington, and of course, much more importantly, the American government. The police in Washington, seemingly under the direction of the U.S. Secret Service, have now gone to the point of shutting off the lights and water into the Venezuelan embassy because of the protective group of Americans who are holding the embassy for the legitimate owners of the embassy. It's quite remarkable. But the Great Vienna Convention that is supposed to regulate the relationship of embassies, foreign embassies in countries around the world, signatories to the convention, would make what's going on here absolutely illegal according to international law. But it's barely reported in this country, and no steps have been taken to observe international law on the part of the U.S. government. It's a scandal. I wanted to mention before we left the subject of Venezuela, though, that the question of oil and Venezuela is indeed only part of the story. That if we did indeed hear something about American history, recent American history, in something other than a jingoistic fashion, we would know what the U.S., Americans would know, what the U.S. has done to our little region over here, as a Secretary of State referred to the entire Western Hemisphere. Noam Chomsky pointed out 10 years ago that the United States has had by then 4 presidents who received the Nobel Peace Prize. I presume that's a record for heads of state. All 4 have left their imprint on Latin America, quote, our little region over here that has never bothered anybody, close quote. That's how Secretary of War Henry Stimson described the hemisphere in May 1945 at the end of the Second World War. He was at that time explaining to the world that what the post-World War II global system would be, and one of its conditions would be that all regional organizations must be disbanded, that's what the U.S. demanded, with the exception of our own, which are to be expanded, including our little region over here, the Western Hemisphere. His position was correct, as others explained. For example, a very influential liberal Democrat, Abe Fortas, who said that for us to expand our system, including our little region over here, is part of our obligation to the security of the world, because what is good for us is good for the world, close quote. I'm not making this up. This is what liberal Democrats were saying after the Second World War. That's self-evident. Well, if we look through the four presidents and their imprint, the ones who've won the Nobel Peace Prize, that was significant. I'm leading up, of course, on to the most recent president to win the Nobel Peace Prize. Let's start with Theodore Roosevelt, the first one. Roosevelt was a shocking racist. I don't use the analogy lightly, but it's a fact that you have to go to the Nazi archive to find anything similar. So here's a couple of his examples about our little region here. Quote, "The expansion of the peoples of white or European blood during the past 4 centuries has been fraught with lasting benefit to most of the peoples already dwelling in the lands over which the expansion took place." The Americas and Africa. That's, close quote, that's what Roosevelt said, Theodore Roosevelt. That's despite what the remnants of Native Americans or blacks or Filipinos or others might mistakenly believe. Actually, genocide denial has been a leading and highly valued feature of the intellectual and moral culture in the United States and remains so right to the present. With regard to the conquest of half of Mexico, Roosevelt explained that it was inevitable and in the highest degree desirable for the good of humanity at large that the American people should ultimately crowd out the Mexicans. It was out of the question to expect Texans to submit to the mastery of a weaker race, said Roosevelt, i.e. Mexico, which owned Texas. And of course, stealing Panama from Colombia was also, quote, in the highest degree desirable for the good of humanity. Chomsky says, I won't go on with Teddy Roosevelt, whose statue graces Mount Rushmore. The second Nobel Peace Prize laureate was Woodrow Wilson, the most honored and arguably the most vicious and brutal of the Nobel Prize laureates. His invasion of Haiti, for example, killed thousands of people, maybe 20,000 according to Haitian historians, restored virtual slavery, and left much of the country in ruins, which in many ways the country still hasn't recovered from. Wilson is famous as an apostle of democracy. He was president during the First World War. The whole idea was that it was the war to end war and we're spreading democracy. Wilson is famous as an apostle of democracy, and he demonstrated his love of democracy by sending the Marines into Haiti to disband their parliament at gunpoint for a good reason. They'd refused to pass what was called a progressive legislation that allowed U.S. corporations to buy up the country. Therefore, they were kicked out of the legislature. But since we do believe in elections, there was a referendum under Marine rule in which 5% of the population participated and 99% of them voted for the progressive legislation, so American corporations proceeded to buy up what remained of Haiti, which was once the richest colony in the world. We forget that. Now maybe the symbol of hopelessness and despair, a tribute to the West. At the same time, Wilson sent his Marines to invade the Dominican Republic. That was almost as bad as Haiti, but not quite, because, as the military has pointed out, in the Dominican Republic there were Spics, not blacks, so you had to treat them a little better. Not much, but some. Both countries, these were explanations were offered in America a century ago. Both countries were left under the rule of the vicious National Guards, the policy that had first instituted in the Philippines a few years earlier. All of this comes down to us in history under the framework of what is called Wilsonian idealism, which is a leading principle of U.S. foreign policy. The third presidential Nobel laureate was Jimmy Carter, for whom human rights was, quote, the soul of our foreign policy. That's what Carter said. His policies in Latin America were explained by Robert Pastor. He's a Latin American specialist and was at the dovish extreme, a liberal American historian. Pastor explained why the Carter administration had to support the murderous Somoza regime in Nicaragua, and when they could no longer sustain Somoza, they had to try to maintain the U.S.-trained National Guard even after it was massacring the population with the brutality a nation usually reserves for its enemy, killing some 40,000 people. And the reason why the Carter administration had to keep supporting them is elementary. To quote Pastor, the liberal historian, the United States did not want to control Nicaragua or the other nations in the region, but it also did not want to allow developments to get out of control. It wanted Nicaraguans to act independently, except when doing so would affect U.S. interests adversely, close quote. That's a fair statement of policy at the dovish extreme of American liberal imperialism. We won't go on to the discussion of President Obama, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, the fourth in the list, and his policy towards Latin America, which the Trump policy towards Venezuela is a direct development of. That's the world that we're dealing in here. That's what's taken for granted by the United States, and the reason that the United States government is responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of Venezuelans right now, and a blatant attempt to overthrow the elected government of Venezuela. You can't make this stuff up. You just have to read the real history.
I would refer, perhaps somewhat in that vein, I would refer to another example of another interview from the podcast This Is Hell with Chuck Mertz up in Chicago. He does it out of Northwestern, but he's actually building his own studio now, or has built it. He just briefly, he interviewed journalist Andrew Coburn, reviews 43 years of Joe Biden inflicted disaster on the world. Andrew wrote the letter from Washington, quote, "No, Joe Biden's disastrous legislative legacy," for Harper's. So if you can read the Harper's article about Joe Biden by Andrew Coburn, or you could just listen to this about perhaps 45-minute podcast provided from a number of points. Just maybe a little bit randomly, just with 7 minutes left, we will I happen to note that there's a program about Muhammad Ali. I'm not sure if it's new, but that's being aired on HBO, a two-part series, and I couldn't help but notice the nature of this blurb, Carl. While known primarily as one of the greatest boxers of all time, Muhammad Ali was also a philanthropist, activist, and political ambassador, as detailed in the two-part HBO sports documentary, quote, "What's My Name, Muhammad Ali?" beginning Tuesday at 7 p.m. They kind of sandwiched activist in there without really detailing what kind of an activist he was at one point in time. I'm sure that'll all be in the program about what happened to him during the Vietnam War.
And his brave insistence to resist the draft.
Yeah. And
do you know where that "What's My Name" line comes from?
What's my name?
What
Muhammad Ali?
I do remember it simply because I'm old enough to have observed it at the time. But
yes, unfortunately, I think I am too. It's Sonny Liston, right? Isn't that what he said to his opponent, Sonny Liston, who didn't want to call him by his Muslim chosen
who wanted
name.
To call him Cassius Clay,
Cassius
his birth name and so forth, specifically to deny the political statement that Muhammad Ali was making by adopting a Muslim name.
Yeah.
And after he'd beaten him in the ring, Muhammad Ali stood over Sonny Liston and said, "What's my name?" and repeated it several times.
Yeah.
You can disapprove, if you want,
Yes,
of
absolutely.
the violence of heavyweight boxing,
Yeah.
and still realize that
Or
here
any
was
kind
a
of
very
boxing, yeah.
here was a very brave, here was a brave and honorable man, and should be recognized as such.
Absolutely. But his legacy has been somewhat whitewashed, and it'll be interesting if I choose to watch this to see how that's handled. I'll certainly give them credit if they include, Howard Cosell and the whole business and so forth. Just one thing, if we have time, Carl.
Sure.
I got to do the Paul Krugman obscenity of the week.
I
Here's
don't
what
know
he
how-
wrote.
I don't know if we have time
Here's
for
what
Paul
he wrote.
Krugman's obscenity. There's a lot of
Here's
it.
what he wrote. I think it speaks for itself if you read between the lines. Krugman, Trump is terrible for rural America. His biggest supporters are his biggest victims. And he writes, that's the title, why then do rural areas support Trump? A lot has to do with cultural factors. In particular, rural voters are more hostile to immigrants than urban voters, especially in communities where there are fewer immigrants to be found. Lack of familiarity apparently breeds contempt. Rural voters are also feel disrespected by coastal elites, and Trump has managed to channel their anger. No doubt many rural voters, if they happen to read this column, would react with rage, not at Trump, but at me. Do you think we're stupid? They would say. But support for Trump might nonetheless start to crack if rural voters realized how much they are being hurt by his policies. As if, Paul Krugman, they didn't realize they were being hurt by the policies of every president before him, that it isn't Donald Trump who created the discontent in among rural voters. Just silliness, absolute silliness. Really shocking.
Silliness with a purpose.
Yeah.
You've been watching News from Neptune for the 19th week of 2019, another week of risking nuclear war, for which the U.S. government is the principal culprit. News from Neptune is presented by Carl Estabrook, David Green, and J.B. Nicholson. It's produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young with Andrew Scholarly. See the research notes on the Facebook page for News from Neptune from J.B. Nicholson. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere in The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies and a good night to you.